Okay. Chapter 5. Is this all in there? Sorry. I know some of you watch these after the fact. Alright, I think it's all in the frame. Chapter 5, Southwest Asia and North Africa. Connected to the last chapter, of course, because they share areas of Africa and other things, cultures, and some languages, religions. So the chapter opener, each chapter has a little opener that it just kind of brief little introduction to what we're going to be talking about. This one looks at what's called Orientalism. What that term means is, well, basically, for many, many years, through things like paintings, but also books and stories from different areas of the world, depictions of what the rest of the world was like entered the European mind and the perceptions of these different places that were not wholly accurate, right? There'd be some accuracy, but a lot of it would be for the purpose of what has been called othering. If you may be taking a cultural studies class or something, you might have heard this term before. But culturally what it means is you're presenting a people as being fundamentally different from yourself, right? And these depictions, including the stories that would be sold in newspapers and books and things like this, would very much want to kind of, well, paint a picture, a literal picture in this case, of places as these foreign, exotic places that are just so different that you could never fully understand what the people are like or their reasoning in their day-to-day life. Which obviously, in my experience in traveling to many places, people are actually much more similar to one another than you would think. But this is something that culturally happens today with books and pictures, but of course today with like TV and movies and even social media at this juncture. The only place that I have been in this region is Egypt. So my lecture is going to be pretty Egypt heavy at certain places, but this chapter is actually a bit Egypt heavy as well, because the area is such a cultural center in lots of ways. So this is just me flying into Egypt, right? Probably kind of a bit of what you might have expected. When I was there, this was January 2011. Some in December 2010, but mostly January 2011. So this was weeks before the revolution happened. People have heard of the Arab Spring. This chapter talked a little bit about the Arab Spring. This was actually, at the time that I went, tourism was at all-time peak. And there are lots of resorts that were popping up in the desert, utilizing water in perhaps not the most productive ways, right, for swimming, but it brought in tourist money, so it's one of those things where it's like, well, so let's see, landed in Cairo, pretty soon off the airport, we stopped and got some gas for the bus for a long journey. This gentleman actually came up to me and he insisted that I take a picture of him and his camel, because he said, well, you're in Egypt, this is what you want for your pictures. And I was like, well, I suppose, okay, I'll take a picture. And through time, lots of tourists kind of came and took pictures, and it was kind of interesting because when we talk about tourism, each chapter will talk a bit about how when you go on a tour, sometimes locals will be basically performing culture, right? Our guide had told us at first that this was just a group of passing by travelers who just wanted to kind of say hi. We're like, okay, And they offered to have photos taken with them. And of course, why wouldn't you want to take a photo? It's like adorable children and baby goats riding donkeys, That's about as cute as can be, right? Well, as we stayed there for a while, and people were taking their photos and whatnot, I noticed our tour guide actually going and paying people. And then I noticed as we were going to leave, more tourist groups came, and rather than a traveling group of people that were just kind of coincidentally swinging by, it seemed pretty clear that this was some of that. That's our tour guide there, and have some money. But this was something of a performance, right? It's like, well, these goats have feet, they could just walk, they don't need to ride donkeys. It's just cute, right? So went into the city. The outfits in the previous photo were very kind of traditional. And it's not that people don't dress like that, because people do. But within cities, I've talked a lot before about how, this is what those guys are looking at down the street. Cities I've talked about, they're kind of internationalizing, right? Especially big cities. And in many ways, they're becoming more similar to each other than even the local rural areas around them. And within the city of Cairo, like people wearing blue jeans, sunglasses. McDonald's has delivery in lots of areas of the world, which I was kind of surprised to find. At the time I was there, well, it was Christmas time, but of course, Christmas time there is different because they have a different calendar, But there was a lot of things that were up that I was kind of like, well, would locals be doing this, or is this for tourists? I think Santa Claus stuff is pretty, I just noticed he didn't have any legs. Santa Claus is also kind of a thin Santa Claus. But there were actually Santa Clauses kind of all over the place. In the airports, I don't really know why, but this is an animatronic saxophone playing Santa, that if you went by it, he would start dancing and playing the saxophone. I don't know what that connection, why that was there. On the tour boat, when we went back to our rooms, we had these that I assume are like baby dolls that are painted up to look like Santa Clauses. But it's one of those cultural things that, again, people felt that we would want. We went shopping for some supplies and stuff, and my tour guide actually, he didn't know much about Minnesota, but he said, aren't you guys really into like deep frying things? Do you want to buy this and take it home? It's like a toy for deep frying. It's like, well, I guess if he's been to the state fair, that is how he would get that idea of Minnesotans, maybe. It's the sign for discotheque. A lot of people, if they picture this region, right, they picture the traditional outfits that we were seeing. They don't picture kind of rural, or I should say urban people, a bit more modernized. At the time also, there was a huge tourism industry. A lot of the tourism at the time was coming from Russia. Now after the revolution, tourism took a real big hit. And the big crowds, I don't know if they've ever have come back. Obviously, pandemic doesn't help either, right? Tourist industry around the world has had some major problems. These little dividers here, these are actually to stop the sand, the blown sand really just kind of stings when it hits you. And they want to encourage people, if they're coming there, to be on the beach. All right, physical geography of this region. Well, I'm just going to go to maps, actually. Maps are just better at showing things. You have a wide range of, you have mountainous areas, right? Mountainous areas, even in this area that tends to be warmer, will be cooler. So you have a greater range of climates than you might imagine. The red lines here are along the tectonic plates. So that's one of the reasons why if you see news stories about earthquakes in some of these regions, especially going through Turkey there, a little bit through Iran, it'll often be along these fault lines. see, I want to kind of point out about the region. Climate, well, as I said, although there's a variety of climates, in general, we're talking about areas that are near deserts, semi-deserts. Looking at a map of climates, you can see that a number of countries in northern Africa and further east will have a bit more of a variety of climates. What's called a Mediterranean climate, it's kind of a weird climate classification name, because you can have places that are categorized as Mediterranean climates, all kinds of different areas of the world. It means drier in general, with a good amount of rain. And of course, along the Mediterranean, kind of makes sense to use that term, but it's used, like I said, worldwide. Let's see anything else. One of the terms of this chapter is biome, large ecological region with similar vegetation and climate. So when we talked about, for example, a lot of the first crops that were first used in agriculture in this area, well, they were able to spread to similar biomes. And then through time, as those had different kind of breeds of crops, they were able to adapt them to have slight different variation in the climates that they would be able to stay at. Let's see. Desert biomes occur where a high pressure system dominates. High pressure system, what does that mean? Well, if you remember in the previous chapter, we were talking about how, like in general around the equator, the sun's coming down, right? In general, more sun on the equator, and that heat hits the earth, and that heat rises, right? So you have the air masses that are kind of always rising around the equator. This is a general trend, right? Well, when the air rises up, it has to come down. But when it rises up, it rains, if you remember that. The air just can't hold on to that moisture. Air is a bit like a sponge. Like, it holds a lot of moisture, as we know, and we see rain and clouds. But when it goes up and it gets colder, it's like you squeeze that sponge out, right? And so when the air comes down, well, it's a squeezed out sponge. It's very dry. And so that's one of the reasons why, let me go back one. You know, you could have areas that are right next to large bodies of water that are still very, very dry. And that's because that air isn't coming from where the water is, it's coming from straight up, right? It's coming from all this rising air drops here, right? Rising air also drops down here, but we're not talking about that region right now. All right. So major deserts in this region, and deserts, if you remember from the last lecture, can have water underneath them. Sometimes, I don't know if you've ever seen any survival shows, but you know, you can dig, and literally sometimes you could get water within a foot of digging, because you know, it's just the top that really gets heated up and gets a lot of that evaporation. I saw one of those survival shows where they had teams who were going against each other, and I don't know why, but a bunch of them were digging like at the top of one of these sand dunes, like very high altitude. They would have to be digging a long time for that. If you're in a desert and you're like are willing to dig for water, not huge odds you will find some, but go to the lowest point at least, right? But then you could literally have some just a foot under. So let's see, being in general drier area of the world, places have had a long emphasis on water management, right? Because it's a very, very precious commodity everywhere, fresh, drinkable water, but especially true in dry regions. There's also a lot of political turmoil over, well, the example of the Nile here, right? Now the Nile, it flows north, right? It's one of the few major rivers that flows north, but that's the way it flows. And so as you can see, although Egypt is where the end of the Nile River is, it is fed in from all kinds of other places who would also like to use that water, right? If they could, they would use as much of it as possible. Egypt has a lot of political power as well as military might, and so there's always a conflict. For example, places will want to put in dams, right? Because the dam could give you hydroelectric power. If you remember, there was a time frame where it was very in vogue to build dams for power, but also you could create a reserve of water if you needed, right? The other thing I want to point out, since we have this map up, in Egypt and along the Nile, it's not just that it's water. You also have really good soils, which could be very surprising to have in a desert, right? And you know, a lot of you probably heard this in other classes and stuff, but well, since the water comes from more of the central of Africa, you know, different ecosystems and more kind of rainforest, right? That's why you get a lot of rain. And a lot of the rain is seasonal, and what you could do, you'll have a great big seasonal rain, and it will cause a good amount of flooding. And it's flooding in the good way in that places that are along a floodplain in this region, every time it would flood, well, I was already talking about how water can leach out nutrients, right? Wash out nutrients. Well, in that water, as the water's going up to Egypt, and it's carrying all these nutrients, and you have a flood, well, those nutrients spill out into the floodplain, right? And it has done this for like, you know, thousands upon thousands of years. So in Egypt, you actually have along a floodplain really good high quality soil. This really super good high quality soil, especially for the middle of the desert. But one of the ironies of our modern age is, well, you put in dams, part of the reason you put them in also is to control flooding, right? Because flooding, well, if you have built infrastructure and you have a city that's right along a river, you don't really want it flooding, right? Because that damages everything you have, people have to relocate. And so each dam that is put in lowers the amount that there would be flooding during those annual floods. So although there is all this thick, rich soil in Egypt and other places, it's not being, there's not new nutrients coming, right? Kind of what they have there is what they got at this point. And there are some places that have a bit less, and there are places where you have soil degradation. The other thing is with each of these dams, right, you'll put in a dam and then you'll have a reservoir of water behind it. That's part of the purpose of it. Well, in dry areas of the world, that means a lot of it evaporates off. So you see in Egypt there it has the Aswan High Dam. There's a great big man-made lake, Lake Nasser there. I'll show you pictures later. But that lake, it's a great big open lake. And well, it's in the center of the desert, very dry. And something like half of the water that would otherwise flow through the rest of the Nile out through Cairo, up to half of it is evaporated off as it's sitting in that large body of water that is a man-made lake, right? And so these are the kind of questions that places have to, well, they have to ponder as they're deciding to put in a dam or not, you know? And it gets even more complicated when you have all kinds of different tributaries, right? And all kinds of different dams and different projects that places want to do that have different cultures, different countries, different national borders, or very often, you know, it could be enemies with each other, but they all have to share a pretty precious resource. Tigris and Euphrates, similar circumstance, a bit less dry, I guess I would say, in general. But again, this is why this is the Fertile Crescent, is availability of fresh water, decent soils, that mixed with, if you remember, a couple of different amazing crops, including specific animals for the region that made it very prosperous. The origins of agriculture locally. Although Egypt, well, they have great ruins and they had a larger kind of what we call a civilization. It was the Fertile Crescent that was before Egypt, and it was the technology of farming that took a while to kind of migrate over. Right? Traditional agriculture and irrigation. Actually, there's good pictures of these. Some unique systems of irrigation that have been done in the region. And this has been done for thousands and thousands of years. But basically what you do is, you can have a water table that goes underneath, right? Although you have lots of evaporation and you won't have rain on the surface, because you have this water table that's coming from areas that have more rain. If you dig, and these aren't just wells, like that may be what we think of here if we think about digging for water, but they don't really get the water to go up. This is more for digging down yourself, and then you make this path for the water. And so this is one of the reasons why you could have lots of areas of irrigated land, and land that has been irrigated for thousands and thousands of years due to these complex systems. And these are often like just super deep and very complicated. I have a friend who used to go diving in these. This is kind of what it looks like from the surface. If you're flying over, you would see like a series of holes, basically. I talked about this already. Similar to what I was talking about in Egypt has happened in countries that need to share the Fertile Crescent's water resources, right? You have some countries that are politically and economically much more powerful. Turkey, for example, has a pretty advanced economy and has a lot more military than a lot of neighboring countries that it shares water with. So a lot of these different conflicts, usually the power that is more politically, has a larger military, honestly, is usually the ones that kind of win these different arguments. Similar deal with the Nile, which I already talked about. Another term from this chapter, environmental security. Body of political science scholarship saying many political and ethnic conflicts stem from resource scarcity, which kind of sounds like a no-brainer, right? It's like, well, sure, if places have scarce resources, but there is a branch in geography that really focuses on this. This branch of geography actually, like many branches of study in different areas, they kind of feel like most problems happen because of the thing that they're looking into, with a fair amount of argument, because if you don't have resources, or if they're scarce, or if they're your resources could be easily taken away for whatever reason, that will of course hinder any kind of stable development. Just an example of when you put in a dam, you'll have a great big reservoir on one side of it, right? That's part of the purpose, is so you have all this water. So if there's an emergency, you need it. If there's a drought, you can have this water. But in dry areas, you're losing a lot of it too. Oh, I don't think I need to define agriculture for you. But a reminder that this is the hearth plant domestication, right? We've actually talked about that already quite a bit before even this chapter. Agriculture, just a reminder, a lot of ancient civilizations, this was the basis of them being able to develop beyond just having groups that were hunting and gathering. Also with agriculture, if you have a very large surplus, everybody doesn't have to be actively trying to get food, right? It's like, you have a surplus. You have, if you remember from the video we watched, you have stores of grain that could last for years, right? And so then you have lots of people that can just do lots of other things. Sometimes, they invent scientific things, sometimes they go to war. Lots of different things that they could do, besides just getting their food. Again, a lot of these terms we've already used. Now, although this is the hearth of plant domestication, it did happen sometimes somewhat independently in different areas of the world. It was just a bit later, but areas that weren't connected to this area of the world, humans everywhere, well, as soon as humans move to some place from wherever they are, they pretty rapidly try to figure out what they could eat and what they can do to increase how much that they eat. So people, like I said, humans tend to figure this out. As you can see, the book goes into more detail of all the different specific species and whatnot. In this area, well, floodplain farming, we've talked about that a bit already, because there's a flood. Typically, obviously, if there's a flood, that is not when you're currently having crops and planting. So you just got to time out. But floodplain farming is pretty common in lots of places. In this region, more specific, oasis. This is just lots of areas that you could have that, well, you have underground water, and perhaps you have land that comes low enough that that water comes to the surface, or sometimes it's almost that low that it's pretty easy to get to that water, so you could have a series of wells and whatnot and have a small amount of stable farming. Lots of crops, domesticated crops that are for drier climates can thrive in this region. A lot of plants especially need just a ton of sun. Let's see, to stick on talking about agriculture and the origins of urban living. Well, if you remember from the videos we watched, once you have that big agricultural surplus and people are able to start just kind of bettering themselves, people formed kind of more intricate and useful types of clothing and shelters, you know. And so that is how kind of the first city started coming about. A lot of these cities would be behind walls as protective barriers. You know, it's kind of interesting. I think it's, no, it's not the next slide. Oh, it is, okay. Well, when you talk about early city structure, in the central city, because these are walking cities is what the term is, walking cities, talks about most cities throughout most of the history of humanity, people had to walk to get wherever they were going to go. You know, you had your feet. So cities were not the huge, large, sprawling things they are today. They were very dense, with everybody trying to live basically as central as possible. Because the more central you lived, well, the less walking around you'd have to do, the more you'd have access to everything. The term itself, suburb, right, that's literally suburban. It used to be a term that meant that a place that you wouldn't want to live, right? It's not good enough to be called the urban, it's suburban. And that's where you would have, you know, your garbage, sanitation, anything that really kind of, like different, I mean, I would call them industries. I don't know if this is of course not after the Industrial Revolution, but you would have things that were dirty trades that would be smelly and just things that people wouldn't want to live by. Those would be pushed out to the suburban areas. And actually, well, the older places had a population, very often the higher in elevation it is, because people just build on top of their own refuse and garbage in previous civilizations. They just build up over it. That's one of the reasons why if you go to places that had ancient societies, you could just dig somewhere and often you could find some evidence of past civilizations. I guess we're getting to the point where we make enough garbage in the world that, I mean, you could dig just about anywhere and find garbage, I guess is how I would say it. It's somewhat true. I mean, we still do it today, right? A lot of garbage is just, we just cover it up, you know? I was, back in the day, I was a city planner for the city of Andover. People know the city of Andover at all?
Where is that?
Andover, it's like to the north, like Ham Lake over there.
Oh, it's here?
Yeah. Exotic Andover. No, yeah, it's just a suburb. Well, the reason I bring it up is just because most people don't know, but there's a big central area that looks like a bunch of green natural pastures and things, but it is actually a toxic Superfund site. And there used to be a whole bunch of garbage fires, especially spare tires, piles of tires that would catch on fire and begin a fire for like weeks over there. This is 50s, 60s, and 70s. Well, the city just attempted to bury it. But that's one of the reasons why if you're over there enjoying the scenic green grass, you may see little signs that say no open flames. That's because garbage releases methane, which is very flammable. So enjoy the greenery, but don't stay too long is, I guess, what I would say. Anyway, just talking about garbage. Well, I feel like I haven't been giving you guys quite enough time to work on questions, and today I do want to do the card system. So let's see, here we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right, so I'm gonna come up with some cards. And pick some groups. Put up your questions, and I'll jump into more specifics about the region and Egypt next time. All right, this is going to be a very randomized assortment of cards this time, of various sizes. So before I come out, actually let me get it to the actual question. Hopefully I was smart and put it at the end. Nope, it was not. Okay, so here's somewhere. This one? No. Hold on 1 second, sorry. There we go. All right. Come out there, and
That was the fusion of the plan.
yes, good.
Different from the 2 days.
All right. And these cards, because I'm using hand sanitizer, they're going to smell. You know, hand sanitizer has a strong alcohol odor. I'm hearing that in prisons, because so much hand sanitizer is available and it has a high alcohol content, people are using it to get drunk. Which seems to me like not a great idea. 'Cause I don't know what else is in hand sanitizer. I said that at some point, someday, we'll start. Oh, are you sick?
No, I'm just like having a pickle.
Okay. Well, if you want to just do the questions independently.
No, I'll wait.
All right. Well, I guess you can't catch a headache. All right. Does everyone have a card? All right, who has blue? Where's a cluster of blue? I think there's a little bit of a blue group over here. So move on over there. How about this reddish color?
I have it.
You have it? Actually, there's definitely a little cluster here, so move on over here. How about pink? Pink. Oh, there's definitely a group here. So try to cluster around there if you have pink. Who has purple? Oh, you're spread about, but there's definitely a grouping here of purple. What color have I not said?
Green.
Green. Who has green? Green is. Do we have a corner? Well, geez. All right. How about that back corner for green?
Sorry.
Move about, find a group, reintroduce yourself because you might be working with some new people. Come get your cards in a second.
No red? Okay.
No, but I was gonna say, try at the tie, what was it again? Whatever stir fry.
Yeah.
What? Green peppers was like making fun of every single thing.
Oh, I forgot to turn this off as always.